Hello.
Bye, nice to meet you.
Bye. Hi, I'm standing again by William Lucy Way, which I've done quite a few times, though not recently. It's a lovely sunny day, probably about 28, 29. And I'm going to see whether I can walk round the east bank of the Thames through Port Meadow. It's often too wet for me to do so. This is a floodplain after all. But we've had so much dry weather recently that I'm hoping I'll be okay. And it may be the last month of the year that I can do this. So let's go. So I'm going to go to Port Meadow. I'm going to walk towards and into Port Meadow over the bridge, over the roadway. And then I'll go across the path to the so-called Bailey Bridge. So-called because it had to be erected very quickly, and so they used the military technique of Bailey bridging to do so. And as I understand it, this involves two innovations. One of these was the fact that parts could be made at more than one factory and were designed to be interchangeable between suppliers, thus easing logistics. And the other one was that large portions of the bridge itself were pre-assembled and moved onto the site pre-assembled. This all makes sense in the context of a military advance, though it's less obvious what it has to do with Port Meadow. But apparently they just needed to replace the bridge very quickly, which was done in 1947 in, I believe, about 2 hours. Looking up Port Meadow Bailey Bridge should provide more information. And the reason it's called Bailey Bridge often looks like a proper name, but it is actually just the name of the technique that I've described. So anyway, I'm going to walk across from here to the Bailey Bridge and then turn north up the Thames. It's nothing I haven't done before. So have a look at the ground. It really does look burnt brown. I think sere, S-E-R-E is the word. It's hard now, apart from the ups and downs in the ground, to remember that this is a floodplain. Thistles everywhere and thistle fluff drifting in the air. Wolvercote. That is Wolvercote over to the north. And I suspect the ground is dry enough that I could just walk literally through the middle of the meadow and through the central bit, which for most of the year is marshy. You won't see it like this much longer. And I notice an abrupt change in colour to the north. Some of the vegetation is much redder than I'm used to seeing it.
It was during work because they went and met.
I can smell at least one barbecue. That's Bossom's Marina, the people who run the boatyard. And I'm now coming up to this red stuff. It's a bit like being an explorer on Mars in one of those 1950s science fiction stories where you see the distinctive rusty tinge of the Martian vegetation for the first time. And then you take it back to Earth and you find that it's got built-in oxygen manufacturing because Mars has such a hostile atmosphere and the commercial patents make you all rich. But this is much more prosaic. I think it's dock leaf spikes. There is a very powerful aroma of what is probably river mud and goose dung. And there are loads of cowpats everywhere. One of the main plants here is something called silverweed, which I think is a member of the Rosaceae rose family. That stuff with the ferny looking leaves. That's the Medley Sailing Club, and almost equally across is a path to the Perch pub. Somewhere around here is a bathing spot or ex-bathing spot and bend in the river called Blackjack's Hole, which I tried to find in one of my earlier videos when I walked along this route. Black Jack, or possibly Black Jake, is a supposed underwater monster, or underwater entity anyway, that drags bathers to their death. Some people say that it was just concocted as a parent's warning to children. Children have drowned here, and there are instances recorded in old coroners' records. Others say that it's part of a tradition of British legends of similar monsters, with names like Jenny Greenteeth is one of them, relating to duckweed, green slimy stuff that wraps itself round you and drags you under. And there's another name, I think it's Grindelow, which may be related to the monster in the Anglo-Saxon epic Beowulf, Grendel. When I mentioned this to somebody, they told me that there's a Grindelow in Harry Potter, which I hadn't known. So while I'm not unduly worried about being connected to Harry Potter by association, it's quite sort of nice to know that in some small way I'm connected to Beowulf. Wouldn't be surprised if Blackjack's hole is that. Okay, now we come up to some flocks of birds. Now you watch, this thing is going to come up towards me, start swinging its neck backwards and forwards, and then peck me on the leg. Or at least that's what it normally does. There we have some boaters. Those 3 trees there must be a convenient landmark for something, surely. Look at that. That row of trees over there is the boundary of Burgess Field, which is a nature reserve slightly higher above the ground than we are here. That is dry almost all the year round, so it's a good way to guarantee being able to walk across Port Meadow. and I can just see a tractor. It's gone. Oh, there it is. Wolvercote is now beginning to expand before my eyes, so I'm not that far away. That's the other side. You can walk up to Wolvercote that way too, and if you do, you come to Godstow Nunnery and then to the Trout. The Trout is functioning, Godstow Nunnery isn't. I've given the Trout good reviews in these videos. It's very, very scenic. As I once wrote, it's almost the dictionary definition of idyllic. But I think for community spirit, I prefer the Plough, which is sort of over in that direction in Upper Wolvercote, not quite Upper Wolvercote, but close, on the far side of the canal. It's got more community spirit. Trout is a bit out of things, and it doesn't really take part in Wolvercotian events, whereas the Plough does. One of the things I want to do in these videos is to provide some canned sunshine so that during the winter people can find the biggest screen they've got, turn down the lights, turn up the screen and luxuriate for an hour or two pretending it's summer. Californians need not apply, they get plenty of sunlight of their own. Another thing I want to do is just to capture as many scenes from parts of Oxford as I can while the weather is good. So this is why I'm jumping about a bit. I did, for example, a series that I've started tagging Continuous Oxford, where what did I do? I think I originally started at Broad Street, and then the next day went up Parks Road and then round the parks and so on, each day taking a different place that was connected to the last one and finding some things to show about it. One of them was a visit to the University Museum. Another was investigating the origin of remember what happened to the dinosaur on Blackwall Road. But not all my videos are like that. There are longish country walks. This is one of the shorter ones. Some of the ones I've done have lasted up to 2.5 hours. And then there are a few comments on social matters, such as the brutalism in Little Clarendon Street, and an assortment of other things. So I don't always know what I'm going to be doing the next day. Okay, so I'm going to turn round and go back now because I want to meet somebody. I won't make it all the way to Wolvercote, and I think I'm going to go back by one of the paths inside the meadow rather than right on the riverbank. Now, looking in this direction, I can see something that makes me want to talk about a topic in economics and trade, or economics and business, which is called externality. And an externality is something that, if you're doing a commercial or business operation, commercial or industrial operation, an externality is a consequence of that which doesn't affect you, or at least you don't particularly worry about it if it does, but it affects a third party. One of the standard examples is car pollution. I drive my car, but the stuff coming out of the stuff coming out of the exhaust affects other people's lungs. Another example of a negative externality would be music. If I stand outside your window at 4 o'clock in the morning and play my xylophone, like that, I'm going to annoy you. I may even wake you up. So that is a negative externality, like the car exhausts, because I'm not particularly worried about it, but you will be, and I haven't paid you anything for the inconvenience. Economics textbooks don't often talk about positive externalities, where the third party gets a benefit rather than a cost. But you can have those too. For example, I was wearing that shirt the other day. I've hung it very badly because thistles are not naturally designed to be clothes hangers. And it made somebody very happy. And I know that it made somebody very happy because this was in the What Do People Do All Day video. And the lady grabbed me round the waist, took a selfie of herself with me, and then said I was bella. So that clearly was a positive externality. It was an operation that I had performed that had positively influenced somebody else, and they hadn't had to pay for it. economics textbooks normally only talk about negative externalities, and I think that's just because economists like being dismal. So to recap, there are a positive externality and a negative externality side by side. Okay, so those were a negative and a positive externality. And I happen to mention them here. It just so happened that I had the shirt and the xylophone with me, because there's a very good example of some negative externalities coming up on the horizon. It's not the Tower of the Winds, the University Observatory that I did in a continuous Oxford video, and it isn't St Barnabas Church, which I can't actually, I can see part of it, I think. It's the last lot of buildings before the small row of trees that then turns into a large row of trees. Those are the university's so-called Castle Mill Flats. So-called because they run alongside Castle Mill Stream, which itself runs alongside the canal. And they're on a street called Roger Dudman Way. Also runs alongside the railway line. And the university got huge amounts of criticism from all sorts of bodies for both the design, the shape, and the fact that they were going to be where they were, because they destroy a historic view cone. They spoil a view that has been there for generations and will now no longer be there. And apart from that, they just don't look very nice. As Bill Bryson once wrote, not about those, but about another lot of buildings, still university buildings, so the university has been building lovely buildings for 1,000 years. Why has it now changed to building horrible ones? It's not as if it doesn't have the money to do the design properly. Anyway, the Castle Mill Flats are a prime... Whoops. Almost tripped over the curb. The Castle Mill Flats are a prime example of a negative externality, because they influence a third party, namely me and everybody else who uses Port Meadow, and they impose a cost in the wider sense. They make the meadow less pleasant to look at, but they don't pay me for the destruction. One advantage of making externalities come with an actual cost that has to be paid, a monetary cost, is of course that it may discourage people from committing them. So if you had to pay every time you put up a nasty building, that would be a very good thing, because you might be discouraged from doing so. At the time these were mooted and then built, I believe the University Vice-Chancellor was somebody called Andrew Harmon. Apologies if I have the name wrong, but it was something like that. I'm pretty sure it was AH. And I used to envisage him like a character in Viz. That's the scurrilous sort of Beano imitation that was invented by a guy called Chris Donald up north, which has characters like Johnny Fart Pants and Buster Gonad and his infeasibly large testicles. Buster Gonad's testicles are so big that he has to carry them round in a wheelbarrow. They're attached to his body, I mean, so the wheelbarrow can't be too far from him. There was a character whose name I can't remember, who had something horrible that he was always trying to get rid of and never could. In every weekly episode, his attempts to do so would rebound. And I used to imagine Andrew Harmon as being like that. Andrew Harmon and his horrible building, or Andrew Harmon wandering around Oxford muttering, "Now where can I put my horrible building?" I imagined him with a large cardboard cutout. Looked like those. In front of Queen's College. On the Rainbow Bridge in the parks. On the top of engineering so that it can be seen from far and wide. Now let's put it in Port Meadow and spoil a view that's been here ever since the earth was cold enough to let life evolve and grass grow. That'll do it. Well, unfortunately, these flats are still following the normal laws of perspective, and they're getting bigger as I approach them, not smaller. If this were a fantasy novel, you might find that they offended the local god of the region so much that he'd find a way of hiding them from everybody's view, and give the Vice-Chancellor permanently aching feet or some suitable punishment in recompense. But instead we just have to look at them. Even the pitch of the roof is somehow offensive. And that long one on the right, I'm not sure, I think it looks like an engine shed. It very vaguely reminds me of the hangar that the Eurostar used to be in a mile or two from central London when it was first commissioned. But you'd pass it on your normal train into London from Oxford, and you'd see a sort of pile of nose cones, if that's the word, stacked up for reuse. But it's considerably uglier than they made the Eurostar hangar. Trouble is, the university, it's done a lot of good things, not least the COVID vaccine, but it's just too big for our own good. It doesn't care where it puts its feet. Now that is a much nicer view. Just appreciates the greens and greys. I've seen similar colours on Dutch heathland. I think it was around a village called Heeze, H-E-E-Z-E. Not that far from Eindhoven. So this takes me back and makes me a bit nostalgic for the Netherlands. That was a very colourful voyage, actually. I was living in the Netherlands for a bit, and then had to go down to work in Athens, which I did by train because it's more interesting. So I did that one autumn, I believe. It would have been around the start of the Dutch university term, which is much the same as ours in England. And I think the train went along the Rhine for a bit. I remember what you might call fairy tale castles and some very persuasive autumn russets and reds, and then down through Mannheim and Munich, and then over and down the Alps, past Brennero, and to Verona, and then eventually to Bari, which is the port that isn't Brindisi, and then to Brindisi. And okay, it was mid-October, but by the time I got back down to Brindisi, there were oranges growing on the trees outside the station, and that was lovely. And then I took the ferry to Patras in Greece, and then the line through Diakovdo to Athens, and that was all great. And I got there and I sat outside my favourite taverna, Babagiannis, in either Themistokleos Street or the next one along, drinking Retsina, and that was also great. There's a travel writer who writes about a time when I think he was in New York or some fairly cold bit of America, and everybody else is taking the morning train to work, and he takes the morning train to the tip of South America instead. He has to make alternative arrangements, I think, by the time he gets to the bit of South America called the Darien Gap, which is notoriously unpassable and tends to involve you with snakes, bandits, every sort of tropical disease known to mankind, and half a dozen other things that you don't want. But apart from that, he seems to have thoroughly enjoyed the journey, and the great thing for me, since I hit cold weather, was seeing him getting warmer as his train went south, first through the States and then through Mexico. There's frost on the window when he leaves, actually maybe Boston rather than New York. By the time he gets to Mexico, I'm not sure, maybe there's a tiny bit of frost, but you can certainly see through it. And then a few hours of travel later, it's balmy, spring-like weather. And I felt the same taking the train from Eindhoven, which is certainly not Mediterranean, by the way, to Brindisi, and then the ferry to Patras and Athens. Now that's clever. They've hidden the Castle Middle flats, well, most of them. That trip, I was working, but I also found time for a good chunk of Greek every day, and I was always upset that I wasn't able to come back to stay in Athens. I had to come back to do some university lecturing, which wasn't very good for me because the university terminated the course soon afterwards. And somehow things didn't work out, so that I then went back to Athens. And some of my best dreams are ones where I wake up and find myself in Athens. However, I'm not unrealistic about this. Athens has earthquakes, and it's had at least one since I left. It's also having massive trouble with wildfire at the moment around the city. I mean, on the mountains surrounding the city. Athens is in a sort of bowl. And it's probably having problems with other manifestations of climate change too. I still miss it though. Well, the fluff is now drifting across Port Meadow. And I have come back to the entrance. I went round the east bank of the Thames, which got me probably at least 2/3 of the way to Wolvercote. I then turned round, discussed externalities, and spent the rest of my time coming back looking at them, namely the Castle Mill Flats. See you next time.